healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. Today's a little bit kind of a different episode. What we're talking about is the newest book being released that Coker's team has authored, and it's being published by the American Association for Physician Leadership. And what we want to do is just kind of talk about what's in this book, because there's a lot here about topics that are very much in demand and common themes that we're seeing in the marketplace today as it relates to hospitals and physicians and medical groups. And it has been for a number of years, and it only continues to grow. So joining me, we have Coker's president and CEO, Max Reiboldt. He's been on the podcast a number of times in the past, and he was the chief author along with a number of other folks from the Coker team. But the book that we're talking about, its title is Affiliation Options for Physicians, Current and Future Strategies. And so this is about affiliation models and different alignment models that we've seen over the years, and we continue to see grow in popularity as far as its popularity with both physicians and hospitals and other players that have gotten much more in the transaction game as it relates to healthcare provider entities. So we're just going to dive in, and maybe if you want to give a quick rundown of what the point of the book is, where we start out, intro the topic a little bit, just so our audience has an idea of what we're even really talking about here when we talk about affiliation strategies.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. And it's good to be on another podcast, and look forward to our discussion today. So the book, as you noted already, is really meant to encapsulate every form, fashion, function, and structure, if you want to call all those things, that involves physicians, hospitals, health systems, private equity, individual investors, consortiums of healthcare, you name it. We tried to think of literally everything and everybody that would potentially be a part of a transactional affiliation among healthcare investors and providers. Wow, that's a mouthful, but I hope that it imparts the message that we really tried to write an all-encompassing book that includes all of these things within it. So hopefully the readers will find it as a kind of a one-stop shop, easy read. That's our style and has always been, hopefully always will be. It's not a textbook. It's an easy read for really all that would be potentially involved in such a transaction. Again, I won't name all those people again, all those types. That's really the intent of it. So we try to run the gamut. If you said, well, okay, so did you talk about group mergers among doctors? Absolutely. Well, what about hospital employment and PSAs with physicians? Absolutely. What about private equity? Did you consider that? We sure did. And I'll just stop there because we really tried to, like I said, consider everything. And it's a labor of love in the sense that I've been personally doing this for Coker Group for almost 3 decades. And over those many, many years, and I'm not the only one, certainly we have many others in our firm, we've really encountered literally every one of these examples, in many cases, many times. And we just felt that kind of given where the state of the industry is right now, even though we wrote it pre-COVID, that it was timely. And hopefully it'll be a good resource for any and everyone that would be interested in the topic. So it's just been a real delight to write it. We're excited about it being published. I think it was actually just published in the last couple of weeks.
As we're recording this, and around mid-August, it was just released August 1st. So it is available, and we will make sure there's a link to the order page in the notes to this podcast. As you look at the table of contents, I think it's interesting because the first chapter is talks about, it's just an overview, but it says specifically calls out 50 years of history. Maybe just briefly talk about the evolution of affiliation models, and it doesn't have to be over the last 50 years, but just within the last 10 years, these models have evolved just tremendously, and they continue to change very, sometimes rapidly. And then there's still models that have been around and work well for decades. So maybe talk about that.
Sure. Well, often we'll use the description, if you've seen one transaction, you've seen one. They do vary, but then again, there's a lot of commonality. But over the 50 years, if you go back, if we're into 2 decades, really almost into our 3rd decade of the 21st century. So if you mark it from, let's just say, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then 2000, the first 2 decades, then obviously that's 50 years. I don't know if this coincides with my age, but in career, but that does kind of correlate with the number of years I've been involved in the workplace, going back to the early 70s. And we really tried to take a look at how the deals have varied. And a lot of that, of course, not surprisingly, changes with not just the industry changes, but technology has had a major effect on healthcare, and well, it should. Certainly the legal and regulatory environment has, and really just the overall economic structure, if you want to call it that again, between physicians, hospitals, the way we're paid vis-a-vis third-party payers, insurance companies, et cetera. And we really just felt as a foundational step for the book, first chapter, that it would be of value to go back and analyze and discuss the various types of transactions. And again, we use the term affiliation options. Believe it or not, if you go back to the 70s, there were not very many, but there were a few doctors that were employed by health systems. There were joint ventures. There were mergers of groups. I don't think we really had much of any private equity back then. At least that's not what it was called. But there were some private investors, as it were. So we've had some things that can go back that far. But as you alluded to, the last 2 decades, in particular, even the last decade, the one we're just finishing in 2020, have really had immense amount of change. And of course, again, a lot of this is fueled by regulatory, legal, the government, both federal and state governments' influence on the transaction and healthcare in general. So we really tried to lay the groundwork for the rest of the book with that first chapter. And I did have the privilege of writing that, probably because I'm the oldest and have been around the longest, I guess. But I do want to emphasize that, and I think you mentioned this, that this was a consortium of several very highly talented Coker consultants that wrote these chapters. I by no means wrote the entire book, and want to make sure that's clear. But I did have the opportunity to write this first one and lay the foundation for the other discussion.
Well, yeah, I think that is definitely an important point. And in addition, I think for those that may be interested in this topic and want to pick up a copy of the book from the AAPL, the progression of the material is interesting because, as you alluded to earlier, we talk about, there's chapters on very specific models. We talk about professional services agreements, joint equity ventures, private equity transactions, even get into kind of clinical co-management, limit and less formal affiliation structures, group mergers, as you said earlier. So there's a lot there that you can get into the specific models and really learn the ins and outs of what each one entails or is very common in each one. But we also talk about some of the kind of general points around this broader topic, such as why are affiliations important? Why are they of interest? And why are they relevant for discussion? And I think that tees up the specific models pretty well. And then we also talk about some of the other considerations. You reference the legal and regulatory landscape. And of course, that is a very central component to any of these affiliation transactions. Also, we talk about due diligence and capital procurement, the transaction process, et cetera. So I think that it's important that it's not just about picking your model or learning more about one individual model, but understanding the dynamics that go into an affiliation process or a broader transaction. There's a lot there. Would you agree?
Yeah, there are a number of options. And I think that another important point about that is you can do some of these models in, I guess you would say, concert with one or the other. They complement one another. And so, for example, many of our PSAs that we're doing will create what we call wraparound deals for co-management, some joint equity ventures, things like that. So even though, just by way of example, there's a separate chapter on joint equity ventures, you could take it and you could also kind of include the chapter on PSAs, which happens to be the one right before it. And in reality, you could potentially do both. And so I think even though we dissected them individually within each chapter, again, you can keep in mind that there's a fair amount of variation that you can have and expansion of some of the deals. And that makes for more complexity. That's true. But it also hopefully makes for a longer term working relationship between the parties. And so what we feel philosophically as a consulting firm, advisors, and I assume the audience knows this, but we really advise all of the potential players. Needless to say, we don't typically do it at the same time, but we may represent a health system, or we may represent a group, or we may represent a private equity firm. And no matter who it is, we always try to look at what I call the universe of the transaction or the potential areas of affiliation. And again, it's not always one size fits all. It's not always just one deal. And so hopefully the readers of the book will see that there's a lot of the mixing and matching that's available here. And again, the goal should be for not just a successful transaction, however way you define that, but one that kind of stands the test of time. And of course is 100% squeaky clean, legal and ethical. So all those hurdles have to be overcome. And again, we tried to look at those various points within each particular model and chapter within the book. So hopefully the readers will agree we address that pretty well.
Well, as you were going through some of the different parties that are typically involved here, there's probably, I would suspect, a little more familiarity from our listeners and those reading the book around these various arrangements between a hospital and a group, or a hospital and a physician, whatever it may be. And those have been around for, as you said earlier, many years. It isn't new necessarily, but one of the trends that has just really blown up over the last 5 years or so has been the introduction or the presence of private equity investors. And the activity and the interest levels from private equity is just it's grown seemingly at exponential levels the last couple of years. And as you mentioned, we're doing a lot of work in these transactions, whether we're representing a group selling to a PE firm or working with the actual investors or maybe one of their platform companies on the buy side of the transaction. But since this is probably a little bit newer trend to some of our audience, just give us kind of the high level rundown, what we're seeing as it relates to private equity deals, some of the different, just again, general trends that we've observed, and maybe even some comments around whether or not you think that's going to continue to grow or what the future looks like for PE deals in healthcare.
Yeah, private equity is a very interesting dynamic, and I think it's here to stay in the healthcare realm. I'll just say that at the outset of my comments. I think it's here to stay because I think private equity investors, and that's all they are, by the way, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a consortium typically of investors. But they like healthcare because it's one of the most, if not the most, notwithstanding some of the recent COVID challenges we've all had, stable industries and growing industries. And needless to say, the percentage of the gross national product continues to grow in the healthcare space. And so I think private equity likes the healthcare industry and will continue to do so. And so that's kind of point number one. The specifics of a private equity deal are fairly consistent, and we do examine them in the primary chapter. Happens to be chapters, well, there's two, but primarily chapter 8. And I guess the other thing that we focus on that I think is relevant here is that, private equity is definitely an option for groups, but it requires a little different mindset because, and I don't want to get too far into the details of private equity deals. You can read our chapter in the book and learn more, but essentially to create upfront value, which is what private equity usually does. And conversely, I think everyone knows that hospitals do not do that, generally speaking. There's no significant upfront money because all the earnings are distributed every year to the partners within a private group. So there's really no, quote, excess earnings upon which you would base a multiple of EBITDA or a discounted cash flow methodology. Private equity kind of shifts the look of that, and they create EBITDA by essentially lowering the distributions of compensation to the partners. And they live by this because it's regulatory really required as well, post-transaction. So if they reduce compensation by 30% post-transaction of the partners, possibly even all the physicians, then that goes to the bottom line and that creates upfront value. And that's systemically one of the key differentiators of private equity. There are a couple of others that are notable, such as typically when you sell to private equity, you don't sell 100% of your business. There's a rollback or rollover of 20 to 30% usually of your equity that is essentially in the new co that's being created, the new entity that may have other practices, by the way, or you may be part of a larger consortium. And so you might say, well, okay, so great. So what do you get for this 20, 25, 30% that you retain? Well, you would get the earnings off of that post-transaction. But the more important thing that you anticipate is what we call the second bite of the apple, which is the subsequent sale at hopefully maybe a better multiple of a larger entity as such. I think that's another key differentiator when you look at private equity. It's not necessarily a long-term proposition, long-term meaning 10, 20 years, where in hospital affiliation, they don't always happen this way, but generally is looked upon to be a much longer transaction. And generally speaking, you don't get any significant upfront money other than for your tangible assets in a hospital transaction or sale. So private equity offers a whole new arena of deal structures. And I've just outlined 2 or 3 of the most prominent ones. And so there's a lot to think about and a lot to analyze. One other thing that's notable, when you do a private equity deal and you're on the practice side, the seller side, it's very much attractive to older, nearer to retirement physician partners. And why is that? Because typically there's not much of a succession plan of dollars. When you retire, you may get the value of your AR and a few depreciated asset value, but little else. Whereas under a private equity deal, you might enjoy more upfront money. And certainly, again, when you compare it to hospital deals, you don't get that, at least not usually. And so it offers a different choice. I'll say one other quick thing and then stop because I could go on private equity. And I know we got to get to other things, but this kind of gets back to the first chapter of the 50 years. We did take a quick look at some deals that were going on in the 90s. If you remember, there was the whole proposition of PPMCs, physician practice management companies. And I always say it was probably the quickest and shortest lived industry in healthcare, maybe ever, because those entities that were really basing it upon an increased valuation and even a public offering just simply didn't work back in the 90s. There wasn't the margins there and a lot of complications. So basically they all cratered. Well, many of them did. Private equity is a lot different. We're not talking about the same thing because you're truly dealing with an investor who isn't necessarily looking to go public. I'm not saying they couldn't or wouldn't, but for the most part, they're not. They're really looking at a more closely held, narrow transactional forum. And so here again, we have somewhat of a new dynamic here that's come on the scene and really in a big way, I would say in the last 10 years, give or take. Yeah. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor for private equity, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. And just as a reference for our audience, this in addition to the chapters that you referenced in this book, we have a lot of content on these models and doing deals with private equity and some of the similar related types of transaction structures. So for those wanting to get a little bit more information on that, we'll make sure that's available, and you can always find that at our website. But I do think it's interesting because there's a lot of interest on the side of the physicians and the medical groups in possibly doing a deal with private equity. I think there's a number of things that are very attractive about it, as you mentioned some of them, and there are other dynamics as well. I think it's important for anyone exploring that possibility to be fully aware of what's involved, because there's some great opportunity, but there is a little bit different. I mean, there's a different mindset. There's different motivation behind doing that type of deal versus something else, maybe with another group or a hospital. And each group is going to be different. Each physician partner in a group is going to have a little bit different flavor, probably, as far as what they really are going after and would like to get out of any sort of affiliation. So I think that's why this is a relevant topic within the overall context of affiliations, because looking at all the options is the point here. And as we kind of bring this full circle, I'd like you to comment what the last chapter of the book just I think tees up a little bit of maybe looking ahead as it relates to affiliation models, particularly in light of how 2020 has gone thus far. And we think about the potential change. We've already had a podcast episode and written a white paper on the potential impact of kind of post-COVID alignment and affiliation models and trends. But as we think about this looking forward, what are some of the things that may be of interest or maybe relevant to our listeners on this topic?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. And we did try to give it some thought as to kind of culminating the whole book with what lies ahead, the proverbial crystal ball. And it was extremely timely because as we were finishing the book earlier this year, that was really when the COVID crisis ensued. And of course, we're still living through it, although hopefully we're through the worst. We'll see. But in any case, we really took a step back and we looked at the whole premise of not just COVID, but kind of post-COVID, and generally speaking, kind of looking at crisis management in general, and how that would also affect these transactions. There's always the temptation to kind of have a knee-jerk reaction to a COVID crisis, any other crisis. What we tried to say was, obviously it's easy to say this, but don't overreact and have kind of go through your typical steps of getting a deal done, all the way from initial discussions, feeling each other out, if you will, to definitive deal terms and really getting it all the way through the change that inevitably any such affiliation transaction requires and entails. And so in the final chapter, we really tried to examine beyond where we are today and where we think even potentially some new models might be out there, albeit somewhat varied from existing models, but also to really look at potential new players into the market. For example, and this is already there, but one thing we didn't do was look at or devote a separate chapter to insurance and third-party payers becoming providers or merging or acquiring. And there's already been a fair amount of that. So we do touch on it in various places in the book, but it's not so prominent, if you will. A couple of notable examples, exceptions, but nonetheless, it's not so typical that we devoted a whole chapter, but we really did take a serious look at it. We also looked at the possibility of government's influence in the future. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, you're talking about future influence. Seems to me they have a lot of influence right now. Well, they do, but needless to say, we haven't gone to a single payer system. And certainly we don't have a crystal ball that says we are or we aren't, but we did give some discussion to that sort of thing within the book and what lies ahead and that sort of thing without making any bold predictions politically or otherwise, that's for sure. So these are the things that we tried to culminate the book. I will say this, and there's by no means a commitment on our part or the publisher's part, but we have been known to write second or even third editions of books, particularly when we think that it's worth it. In other words, readers would be interested. And secondly, there's enough of a change, if you will, or things that need to be updated to warrant a second edition. And so who knows, we may or may not do that with this book, but we tried to finish it out with that sort of discussion. And hopefully, if nothing else, it'll provoke some thinking on the part of the reader to realize that, again, 10, 20 years from now, who knows what the new look will be. And therefore, put some of these models, they may still be around and who knows, there might be brand new ones. But we tried to give at least a decent amount of thought to where we think we're going and where the industry is right now.
That's right. And you referenced one of the themes of that looking ahead or looking at what lies ahead is dealing with crisis management. And it's a good opportunity to tease what's going to be our next book that will be out hopefully later this year, but is specifically on crisis management. And it is not just talking about the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, although that is the crisis certainly of the day, of the year. But it could be any number of different types of crises. And we've seen them over the years. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a man-made disaster. It could be a global pandemic. I mean, it could be any number of things. It could be much smaller than that. So I think the perspective that the industry and really everyone collectively is gaining on crisis management is very worthwhile to talk about. And I haven't seen anything from specifically talking about the healthcare provider industry as it relates to preparing and dealing with crises. So I think that'll be something that's very interesting and probably of interest to our audience. And as it relates back to this, there are so many different things that if you take what we've seen thus far in 2020 that can impact specifically a transaction process. It can impact the timeline. We've talked about before the impact on valuations and the impact on the economics of a deal, the structures and terms, the regulatory and governmental response to transactions and kind of how they're going to look at transactions from a governing standpoint in the future. So there is a lot to look ahead towards and a lot to kind of think about that could change or at least different things that could be very impactful as both physicians and hospitals, private equity sponsors and anybody else involved in these types of deals would be interested in learning about and would really want to know before they go into that process. So I think it's going to be very relevant. Again, we've written on literally all of these topics many times and presented at conferences on many of them over the years. And I think it's good that we can kind of have all culminated in one place, some really good information on this. And of course, we have a lot of supporting information that we've written, which everybody can find, again, on our website, all of that material. So this has been very helpful. Again, we will provide the link in the notes of the show for where you can go and actually order a copy of the book. It is available. But if you want to go look it up, it is available from the American Association for Physician Leadership. And it is titled The Affiliation Options for Physicians, Current and Future Strategies. So thank you for giving us a rundown of the book. And for anybody out there that has any questions or would like follow up on any of the stuff we've talked about or help with ordering the book, just do not hesitate to reach out, and we'll look forward to your feedback.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.